Kevin, it is awesome to have you on the show, man. I'm super excited for our conversation, and I'd love to kick it off with just, I think something that maybe resonates with everybody to some degree, but you were really into like Shaolin monk training, like the real hardcore, like body tempering type stuff. Tell me
Yeah.
a bit about that process.
Yeah, when I was early in my martial arts, it was less Shaolin. I did a bit of I taught kung fu for a while, but it was more in the Japanese martial arts. I was jumped when I was young, and I was really small, so I joined the first thing that I found, which was Shotokan karate, and it wasn't particularly well taught. And I invested in it, man. Like it was the only thing on the planet. If you wore the pajamas, it was all the same thing, you know. And after about 6 years, it just wasn't giving me any yields. Then I met my jiu-jitsu instructor, and he was hardcore. Like he was big into body hardening, also big into spiritual practice and Zen Buddhism. So we were doing everything: cold water tempering, body hardening. I had my pails of sand and gravel, and I was spearhanding it every day. My hands looked deformed at that point in my life. I would say that there is value in some of it. I definitely went too hard on everything. When I was like 18, 19, I remember if I met an instructor who was like 30 and already crippled, I thought, man, they're so old, you know, so far away. But longevity and health and mobility became increasingly important. And then I did find other instructors who balanced it and tempered it out. But I still like it. I still like the purge of. I have a makiwara striking post, and it's minus 14 outside here today, and we have about a half meter of snow. And I start my day with the ice bucket, and then I hit the makiwara and try to crack all the ice off the burlap. And then I come in, you know, I need this in the morning. So I really enjoy it. But yeah, there was a point where I literally quit my Kung Fu practice the day I walked in and they were starting to train testicle retraction.
Oh, no.
And for me, that was a bridge too far. Guys with towels around their waists and little weights on their scrotums. And I was like, okay, this is too much for me. So that was the day I left that. Yeah. So, but I still enjoy some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you probably don't want to come out day one with testicle retraction work. I mean, that's a line though, I'm sure, for a few people.
That's why there were only guys in the school. I was like, that's how come. Yeah, it was terrible. But yeah, it was a thing.
I imagine it's almost like I remember in the old Jackass movies in the beginning of the show, they would have, don't try this at home, you and your little buddies, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like as long as there's Shaolin monks like doing a very dedicated and gradual and progressive overloading practice somewhere, there's going to be somebody who does the just go for it all out. Probably not. I mean, it sounds like those guys were, but probably the less mindful version, or as I've kind of become fond of saying, like the Temu version, like the Temu version of Shaolin monk training and body hardening. Get hurt.
Well, I remember I went to see Shaolin monks, and I was in the front row with one of my students, and there was this one dude that I had seen on the internet breaking metal files on his forehead. I was like, wow, there's got to be like a technique or whatever. Then I'm in the front row, and the guy's forehead looked like a 1970s pro wrestler. It was just a hatch mark of scar tissue, and he had different degrees of wounds, and he was on the road every day doing it. And I was like, that's the secret. There is no secret. Just hit it as hard as he can, you know? And he was just wounding himself, you know? So that kind of stuff. I always say that if you're training for self-defense, why certainly damage the health you're seeking to possibly protect, right? Your training is certainly going to damage you if you do that consistently, and you may never get attacked. So what was the value of that? So I try to, we refer to it as a calculus of violence. What are you willing to risk for the payoff? If you're a Navy SEAL, if you're deploying every day, it's a bit different. If you're an accountant, it's drastically different, right? So we gotta modulate it. But then, you know, sometimes people need some penitent training. They need to purge the demons. So there's value in that too.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I want to get to that question too, as well as like kind of that line of like suffering and being smart and a calculated good amount of that type of work in a training program. The thing that always did intrigue me with like the Shaolin monk type work, and as well as more of my realm, and where the collision happens like a jump or a sprint, it's between the foot and the ground, or even the internal forces in the shoulder and a throw, and something that's just, I want to say sport is full of collisions. So I look at like the Shaolin training and I think, is there, if I do more drops, and I've had people on this podcast who have done hundreds of drops and have talked about it and that kind of thing, but I do think like, what is the limit and the appropriateness of the
Yeah.
hardening and that, and it's a really high yield area. And what is myth and what's reality? I mean, if you had to say like, okay, what is like you said, that guy had all the marks on his forehead, but
Yeah.
if you had to like wrap up, I guess what we could learn from that from a general perspective, dealing with collisions.
Yeah.
I mean, how much can we? What's the I guess what's the real takeaway as you see it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at something like, let's say, knuckle hardening, right? So there's a huge misconception that you're trying to toughen up the knuckles, right? And this is the main thing. It's what's called Wolff's law or Wolff's principle. You put the bone under stress, and the bone's going to thicken. And that does happen to a degree. But when I was young, I remember like my knuckles looked like mushrooms. They looked like warts. And my sensei was like, whoa, you got to moisturize that stuff and you don't need this. And I was like, okay. So I did for him, but then he moved and I immediately went back to the cosmetic drive to make these things look as ugly as possible. And then one day it ripped off. And then I had this open gaping wound. And now all this training was gone temporarily for, a month of healing. That was my first sort of insight into it. When I bounced, I was working as a doorman for years. You hit a guy in the teeth or you get some jewelry. Callus doesn't do much. And then later teachers said, look, it's a meditative practice. You're learning the surfacing and the alignment and the variability, and you're learning to modulate how much power you put in, that we all have enough to destroy ourselves. So for me, it became like an ego tug of war. Now, I necessarily needed to do a lot of stupid stuff because I was that dumb. I always say that I needed a drill bit that hard to get through the granite of my skull. So I don't think I could have done it any differently. Now, like many of the old guys that used to coach me, I try to give caveats to people, but I also give them the freedom to make the mistake, right? You have to kind of parent and say, well, you can't stop them from tripping. They got to make their own mistakes. But I think you need to be there telling people that's not the way. You're going to destroy yourself. And certainly guys that were in their 30s and 40s when I was 20, and now they're still doing it at 80 and they look great. And then other guys are 60 and they're hobbled. That's very clear evidence as well, So I think the dissolution of the self, if I wanted to get Zen on it, the mindfulness, like anything, if I was lifting weights every day, there's always going to be a point where you lift too hard, you don't recover enough, you lift too much, you blow out your back, you might develop a chronic injury that's always in the background that you have to modulate. But to some degree, that can be a blessing. I think that can normalize you. I used to be a super acrobatic, splitting high kick guy. And then in jiu-jitsu, I had my big toe and ball of foot traumatically dislocated and torn off. That changed everything. That changed my desire to whip that out or use it as a support. So that was ended up being a gift. And it affects my function every day, even now, in my 50s. So you kind of have to take what you got and, make the best of it.
Yeah. The mindfulness piece is really interesting to me. I think about stories in athletic performance about so-and-so did like 300 drops every other day and the drop landing. And like you said, there's some people who can do that stuff and they're okay. And then some people just get destroyed. And I do think it really polarized it right off the bat and said, okay, one guy does 300 drops and they aren't thinking about anything and they slap the ground like just a ton of bricks, just bam, every time. Yeah, they're going to look pretty bad pretty quick. They're probably going to get hurt versus someone who like they're very mindful and maybe they're in an environment that breeds mindfulness. Like I think about a Shaolin, like if you were in a monastery and it's in nature, you don't have a phone or screens and, it's a very kind of, I'm sure there's a lot of meditation involved and there's just a very internalized thing. I would imagine that would lead you to a higher volume tolerance than someone who's just like, oh, I'm just going to copy this and just start pounding on something just for the sake of getting the reps in.
Yeah, and if we learn anything from kung fu movies, is if you go too fast, too hard, you become the bad guy, right? So I think you can do anything wrong with. It's like in lifting, you got guys that try to take shortcuts and chemically enhance and whatever else, but are they depriving themselves? I tell the story often. When I was young, I read this Bruce Lee article. And somebody asked him in Hong Kong, how did you become so good? And he said, everybody else was taking the stairs and I took the escalator. And this like, whoa, shortcuts, amazing. And I came in and I told my sensei this, and he just turned to me and said, yeah, but you don't stay in shape taking the escalator. And then I went, oh, it's a double revelation in one day. But that's it. Some shortcuts are great. Efficiency is amazing, but some things just take time. And it reminds me of the old Schwarzenegger interview when they're asking him about his chest development. And he was doing 6 sets of 6 exercises. I think it was bench, incline bench, flies, dips. Then he was doing like, overhands and I think cable pulls. And he says, I don't know, there might be another way, but I only know how to do it with 36 sets. 6 sets of each, that was it. And like it worked for him. He loved it. Was he OCD? Was he compulsive? Maybe. But that's all part of what made him have that chest, right? So you can't just mimic the weights and mimic the reps and hope to get the same result,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think about my, when I was in high school, I did, speaking of collisions, I did started a depth jumping program, like jumping off of boxes, and eventually pretty high boxes and hitting the ground and yielding and rebounding. And it worked so well. And the older I got, the more I realized that what built me up for that was like doing every other plyometric in all the years before. And always like jumping up the stairs and doing like jump rope and single leg jump rope all on my own. Just like getting all these contacts and kind of slowly, gradually building that like hardening of the tissues and prep. And it was funny too, because a lot of it wasn't on a program. I just jumped rope on a single leg because I wanted to do it. And so it wasn't like, oh, you have to do 5,000 reps. It was just do it until you feel like you did enough and then go play basketball or do something else. And so
that's right.
I think that definitely helped. I just really quickly, because I wanted to get your formal bio in here, but just to say, have you read the book on like the Mighty Atom or like the work of the because I was curious, because I thought what I was thinking about with you mentioning your hands was his like forehead, I guess, even like the following of his hair, like because he did stunts trying to pull hair and thinking of, and that was like thicker, like his skin. I would have been funny, like if I met that guy, I think one of the first, probably not the first, but like I would have probably asked to feel his like forehead, because like, what does this feel like when your follicles, all this is literally thicker from years of you doing this. And I knew he had a big internal practice. There was a lot of like, very inner game oriented practice to all his work as well, which again, I think that's an interesting common thread. I still don't know the answer to how it works exactly, but I just know that's all there. So,
well, growing up, one of my buddies in school, his dad was a pro wrestler, but it was the kind of pro wrestler that would lose every local match to some traveling hero, So we got to like hang around at the arena, and I got to see like a lot of these hardcore wrestlers. And I remember as a kid, I met a guy named Bruiser Brody, who was, I think he was about 6'8", 6'9", but this guy's forehead, if you want to lose sleep, Google his forehead. He would cut himself every single match with a razor blade, with a chain, whatever. He ended up dying by getting stabbed because he refused to take the loss to another fighter, I think in Puerto Rico. And he would stay in character nonstop, so he was this wild barbarian. But he was so terrifying. Everything about him, his knuckles, his hands, just the thickness of it. Was a football player originally, but it was just the abuse of the ring twice a day that just made his body into something fearsome, just a terrifying monster of a man. And then on the side speaks super eloquently, but then he'd go into character and just. So I think you can get scar tissue. I mean, Jack Dempsey used to take the brine from pickles and wash his face with it in order to thicken his skin, and he would chew tree sap to make his jaw stronger for punch resistance. So
interesting.
It's not exclusively in the Asian martial arts. There's a lot of tough characters out there.
Yeah, it's something that the whole skin thickening thing, like people to have the wherewithal to think about that. I feel like it's hard to have those characters in the modern age. There is, speaking of the digital age, there's an Instagram influencer. His name is Samuel Carr. I forget what his handle is, but he does like rock climbing and running and all these like calisthenics. And he calls it like the dog paw treatment. It's something he figured out for his fingers to stick on the wall better. And I love that stuff, because I feel like sometimes, I mean, there's more people in the world, you see what's going on more, but sometimes I feel like it's less likely for those just like innovative thoughts to emerge. Whereas back in the days, all you had was I'm curious sometimes the likelihood of creativity now versus then. But that's really interesting with Jack Dempsey doing that too. We don't think about that stuff, I think, like probably people used to.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you during COVID, I was forced to make contraptions. That's all I did, mannequins and dummies. And I got so creative because we couldn't touch anyone. You couldn't train with anyone. I was going crazy. So I think a little bit of alone time is very good for that type of creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, so before I could just keep getting carried away with follow-up. So I wanted to ask you too, after a little intro with the Shaolin monk ideas, tell me about what got you into martial arts? And just give me like a nutshell, maybe not like an elevator plus, like a tall building
The
elevator.
30-second?
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
a tall building, so a little longer. But yeah, how you got started and then where you are now with martial arts.
Yep. So I got jumped. I started in karate. I did that for about 6 years. Then I switched off to Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. That was my first black belt, my first great teacher. I started bouncing when I was in college, working as a doorman and throughout university. Then after that, I got into private security and bodyguarding, security contracting. So I had a lot of exposure to violence. Now I have 5 black belts. My highest rank is a 8th dan in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. I also teach Russian Systema, but a very pragmatic, non-mystical version, but often it has a bad rep. And I had a school up until COVID for about 30 years. And then just after COVID, I just kind of got tired of brick and mortar and focused on meditation, solo training, writing, doing contracts around the world. So that's what I'm doing now, kind of living a gypsy life and enjoying the rest of not having to pay massive overhead rent. But there may be a school in the future. It's just taking a few years off now to reinvent.
Athletic performance is built on a spectrum of training methods, from high velocity skills to power training to strength work. And on one end of that spectrum, on that strength end, you have the most targeted work in the form of machines. And this is part of the reason that so many top speed and strength coaches have their favorite machines to deliver that targeted stimulus. For decades, Hammer Strength has been a top provider of reliable, effective machines that are trusted by coaches and athletes worldwide. They fit seamlessly into that total performance program, delivering that targeted strength stimulus. When it comes to your machine-based strength training needs, think Hammer Strength. Yeah, I'm sure that even process too, not having to deal with that stress of that modern days of overhead has allowed your brain to probably work in some ways as well.
Yeah, it was 60 hours a week for the last 15 years of the school. So it was a lot of time and no breaks. I didn't really have replacements. So I had my senior students that would cover me if I went overseas. But if I had like broken anything, I just had to keep training. So it was tough. It was tough because you got to do your private lessons and the sparring, and it was a bit hard on the body. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I'm particularly excited for this conversation, and I'll say I have like a very beginner's mind with martial arts because I have almost no martial arts experience. So I'm like, oh man, I get to talk to you go to handle the combat professor. I'm like, I love just being able to go right to the source here. And it is interesting. Even like have my children, they're 2, about 7 and 9, and getting them trying to figure out what martial arts to put them in. We went to a jiu-jitsu class once, very kind teachers, but very just not very representative, not very playful. My kids didn't remember much, although my daughter did put me in kind of an arm bar after the class. I was like, oh, you remembered something. All right.
Yes.
But it just gets me thinking about just sport in general, because kids will go to basketball or volleyball or whatever or football, and they aren't really like learning real world, like play-based, exploration-based activity. And I love how you mentioned you were a doorman, you worked in private security. It's not like you were an instructor who just taught punches the whole time, like real life crossover. And so that's so much of what I want to get into today. But I want to start with something that maybe is more probably, no matter who you are listening, if it's, martial arts or sports or just even general strength. I want to talk just about general strength training concepts, and maybe we can branch out from there. But one of the things I think is really interesting that you talk about is body tension in training. And I wanted to ask you about, maybe this is almost opening up a can of worms right away, but I imagine in martial arts you see it a lot, but like just students who are very tense, like they do things and there's just a lot of try hard. You can tell there's a lot of anxiety or even your past trauma, I'm sure is common with people coming into your class. Tell me about how you study an athlete or a student in terms of their body tension and their expression and how you work with that.
I mean, if I'm 100% honest, the first thing, you're always looking at, because I had a very well-known school. We had a huge population at one point, so we had a lot of challengers coming in. So the first thing is always vetting, is this guy going to jump you? We had a lot of that. Montreal is a very, as the old jokes goes, we went to a hockey fight and a game broke out. So they kind of like that mindset. So I'm always vetting where they're coming from. I tend to be a little cautious at the beginning, just because of that. And I think that's the private security background. Then there's lots of reasons why people can have chronic tension. So I try to see, have they identified what their motive is? We call it putting the self in self-defense. Do you know why you're here? Like the bodybuilder that wants to get huge and jacked.
Yeah.
Do they know why? Right? What's the inner child damage that we're looking at? I deal with a lot of trauma survivors, so I've become very good at identifying and sort of coaching them through that, being sensitive to that. But some people just have, reinforced trauma, physical trauma, fear from life. And so I try to make it very welcoming for all types. It's a very inclusive environment at our school. My general approach to tension is if we can collectively with the student, if we can figure out what your triggers are, have an open discussion about it. I'm very open with my students. I admit all of my failures. I talk openly about my limitations. I encourage people. If I have a parkour kid that can do 3 backflips, then go do that thing, be better at it. I'm not going to be able to coach you on the specifics, but I try to get them to invest in what they do. And then generally when we find an area where there's a blockage or a physical tension, I like to go more tense. I like to do like selective contraction, teach them general principles about spinal bracing, engaging the core. Some of them, generally I use a very Western perspective, but some of them need a more, internal, whether we're talking chakras or abdominal locking or whatever the Japanese terminology would be. I'll meet them wherever I can find them, and just try to get them to take ownership of their body. And the simplest motion, let's say squatting. Like I'm a big fan of mobility and deep squatting. So I make people dwell in things. I make people explore them, get to their second and third psychological wind, get past the boredom, feel new pain. I think there's a lot. The greatest relaxation comes from exhaustion, I've always found. So your psychological reserves get depleted. You start to have to be more creative. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of training the weakest, most tired part of my body every day. So if you come in and tell me, Sensei, I ran a marathon today. Oh, lesson plan change. We're doing legs, I'm going to try to, be led by my students, but also take us all where we least want to go sometimes, because I think that's where you get the most authentic development. But yeah, tension is a big thing. Like every single motion we do, if you add contraction and then you learn how that affects your structure and then you integrate your breathing to that, there's so much learning that can come. This morning I was doing flies. I have a bit of a loopy shoulder. And every time, depending on the temperature, depending on the day, it's always a different body, right? So I had to do certain different alignments and mobilities, and that's where I go. I get bored by sets and reps. I'm just not a guy for that. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm like a hummingbird on Gatorade, So I always have to find something internal about it. Otherwise I get bored fast. And so that's kind of where I go with students. And then if it's trauma, I try to be as respectful as possible. I teach at the local college for criminal intervention. So these are all future social workers and interventionists, prison guards, etc. And I'm a triggering human, right? My stories, my experience can be very triggering. So to balance honesty and open disclosure with receptiveness to their response to the triggering, it's important. You have to have an open dialogue. And I think anybody coaching has to do that with a student. I think that's very important.
Yeah. I like, a couple things. One, you talked about like the fatigue and relaxation under fatigue. So I do want to, my next question or my second to next question will be about like longer holds or longer, especially in my end of things, like long ISO holds are kind of an intriguing piece. I think I have coaches who use them and myself from a couple minutes all the way up to like 5 minutes plus. And I know like horse stance too. I think people treat like long ISO holds sometimes like it's a new thing in strength and conditioning, but I had heard like, hey, you want to get in the dojo back like, I don't know, in ancient China, you got to hold a horse stance for 20 minutes outside the door or something. Or I watched like The Legend of the Drunken Mancer, which is obviously fiction, but I find it funny. Jackie Chan's like holding the horse stance and he's got like the cups on his head and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I still do this. I mean, our last black belt exam, Sebastian and Ian were my 2 most recent black belts. In the 12-hour exam, one of the things they had to do was hold a push-up with a staff between both of their necks. So it's shared on them. In the middle is a 60-pound bag of sand hanging on that stick. So they're keeping good posture and they have a candle under their faces. If they blow it out from exhaustion or if they sweat it out, they get a fresh candle. and the drill's done when the candle's done.
Mm.
So I told them, be thankful you have an IKEA tea light. I had like a Yankee Candle chubby under me on my exam. It was, and it smelt of lavender, and I have trauma from lavender to this day. But it just lasted what it lasted, man. If it was 3 hours, we did like a 2-hour meditation under a waterfall on one of our exams. And, it was it 100% physically healthy? Probably not. Spiritually purging? Absolutely. The one go-to, and I encourage everyone to do it, I take it from Russian Systema, is a slow push-up. And one of the first things you'll learn to do is just get in your push-up position. You got to do it on your knees, do it on your knees. You got to do it on your feet, palms, fingers, knuckles, thumbs, whatever you want to do it on. And you just see how slowly can you do it. So a good starting point is slow down your inhale and do the downward portion on the inhale. If that takes 10 seconds, then 10 seconds up. We generally try to get to a point as a baseline, being able to do about a minute down, minute up. And, your last 25% down's all right. Your first 25% up is brutal. It's brutal. And we have done those for an hour. We've done 30-minute downs, 30-minute ups. Your arms give out, your spirit gives out, you break. There's a Russian expression that says you have to break the man for something new to grow. So they're big on long, slow holds. My Japanese teachers were routinely making us hold horse stances for hours. You can't undo it. You can't undo that experience. It stays with you. And they would always tell us you could lose your arms, your legs. You could be in a wheelchair. You will not forget this experience. This is in your reserve. So that's how I approach it. I think it's important in my solo training. The hard part when you don't have a trainer is to do it alone. And as somebody who has an expectation upon them, you have a little bit more fire, but it's tough. Like on a cold morning going out, and it's just tough. So I try to do stuff that purges every day. Long holds are probably the best one because they get you to go inside your breathing and your structure.
Yeah. One practice that I've become very fond of is doing and this is almost a total other end of the spectrum in some perspective, because a lot of what I do is very quality, speed, and power oriented. So limited fatigue and very calculated with maximal freshness.
Yeah.
But I really like doing like a minute 30 to a 3-minute iso lunge hold on each leg before that sprint session, because it's not so much that it cripples the sprint session. And honestly, if you're in shape for it, it's a primer. Like, it's actually good. Now, if it was a 10-minute hold and I had a candle, okay, probably not. That's probably going to mess up.
Where would the candle be on the lunge? That's the question.
I don't know. I have to have it on a lever somewhere. So, I know Jackie Chan. Yeah, didn't he, like, his horse stance? He had like a spike under his butt.
Yeah, we would do them at the park on like the posts, with a foot on each post, and it's brutal. Brutal.
I was like, I don't know what that setup is exactly in that movie, but anyways, but with the lunge, I'll do that and do a few like drops, like the collision, and then that's like my ritual in that sense. And I think of it sometimes almost like it does feel good. You get like some muscle length, you get some metabolic temperature and some other things going. But it's also like, I always think of it as like, sometimes speed and power gets so hung up on freshness. There is like a little toll to pay still. There's still like that little ritual. There's still that little bit of like boredom and willpower, and even wrapped up within something that's very quality. It's still like, hey, still got this thing, and I've really, it's almost hard for me to do a sprint session without it, just because I'm such a habit, where I wanted to go with that was, you mentioned Systema, because as I was reading your book, Rituals of Strength, I was thinking about where a lot of strength coaches get a lot of their ideas on long iso holds. And there was a coach, Jay Schrader, who had a lot of long iso holds in his program. And he said he got a lot of his work from like Russian sports science, but you don't see the long isos in the Soviet, like the 60s and 70s stuff. And then I was like, oh, maybe it's the Systema, because I guess Jay was really obsessed with Russian stuff, and I'm sure he'd probably come across Systema, and that's ancient stuff. So I was reading in your book about Systema and the long push-ups, and I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And then even as well, I think you had highlighted it, but just the idea of if you can combine like basic strength training with also like a slow, like a very controlled element, the actual strength boost. Like you can be hitting all the cracks you've been missing all this time, and it can yield an actual strength boost, even in addition to the mental piece of it all. So I think that no matter who you are, just that element, I think, is very intriguing and useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, the Soviet stuff is off the hook. I mean, now a lot of it is available translated freely online, which is great. If you're interested in plyometrics, man, check out the early days of plyometrics. The Russians, they applied it to everything. I mean, there are studies on the origins of boxing punching power, and what percentage is from the foot and what percentage is from the calf, and how this much isometrics and this height of box jump will improve this. And they were so specific. They were measuring everything, adding elastics, like just intense stuff, and I mean, even if you look at things like Bulgarian lunges, Bulgarian bags, that kind of organic work, very cool stuff for deep holds, deep resistance. A lot of the Russian Sambo guys would do their suplex work with grappling dummies and hold deep phases of the squat, then go up an increment, then just go up and down, just a centimeter of rise and drop for an hour, just very, very progressive. So they're very big into the long, slow opportunity for contemplation, and it's just it's also a preparation for a harder life. I think circumstances, living conditions were rough.
Oh, yeah.
The military mindset was different. The old axiom you always hear is that NASA spent whatever it was, $250,000 to design a pen that could write upside down, and the Russians sent a pencil. That was the whole thing. And like here in Canada, same thing. And you were going to be a pilot, they'll throw you in a gyroscope, and if you puked, you're out of the program. In Russia, they put you back in until you stop puking. It was just a different mindset. So they really are into exposure, progressive exposure, and just embracing the suck, for lack of a better term. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that.
Yeah, I agree. And it brings you back to like the set and setting idea with like, okay, you got the Shaolin, like the hardening Shaolin monks, and what's the setting there? And then the long ISO or the very slow controlled or like painful stuff. What's the setting?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about how Russian sports science was influenced by like that, as well as maybe a culture backed by the Systema and like the slower movements, because that was the first time I had heard of a super slow was like, hey, you're going to do a javelin throw motion and you're going to do it, 5 minutes or something, or that was Russian stuff. But how much of that was it really just a sports scientist who was like, oh yeah, let's do this, versus this has been in our culture. We watch the wrestlers do this. We watch the comment, like you said, like they're holding like the bag in a certain position. And one of the things I've been thinking about as well is just like how we come up with ideas. And I was watching some videos. I have a book on Leonardo da Vinci's life, but I've read like 5% of it. But I'm so...
It's all written backwards and in lemon juice. That's what's complicating.
I put in the mirror to actually read it. But I just think about, again, parallel with modern life. Like it was, we're almost cursed in some way with a lack of need for wherewithal, like writing things down, being hyper aware. Like Leonardo was hyper aware, asked a million questions about every single thing. And it strikes me that, okay, you don't have a phone or any digital distraction, go through this thing for 5 minutes. How much room for contemplation comes up, contemplating your technique that even would go beyond. And now it's like we live in this world where the coach has to tell you everything, and you're coached, and hey, do this thing, do that rep. Okay, come back. Okay, now do this thing. Okay, coach, now do this thing. And how different is it to say, well, let's start by, maybe there's some instruction, but doing something and stringing it out for that long, you're guaranteed to make a lot of connections a coach could never tell you, especially like very internal ones.
Yeah. I think a thing about Da Vinci too, I write about him in my book on Buddhism, is that in a time of extreme apprenticeship, he was very late to that table. He was like an early adolescent before he was officially mentored. And during his young life, he specialized in architecture, mathematics, science, botany. So he came in with a lot of unregulated ideas. And you see that carry over. So he never became a slave to one specific structure. And he never defined himself as just a painter, just a designer. He was always cross-referencing. So I think that's really the key to genius, is combining basic things in novel ways. Da Vinci really has always been. I was an art teacher back in the day, so Da Vinci always held a very special spot there. But yeah, I think that's part of his genius.
Yeah. As I was reading your Rituals of Strength book, I think it was that one, and just as I was kind of also ADD-esque reading the Da Vinci book, I was like, you're like, oh, you drew all day when you were a kid. That's awesome. Yeah. I used to draw a lot too, not all day, but a lot. Like I had big sheets of paper and would spend a good amount of time. I'm not a great artist, but I I'm like, I do think that's a language that I should learn better. Like, I think,
Yeah.
a lot of coaches would, and not everyone's artistically inclined, but it's like, if that's your language, I feel like if you are,
Yeah.
there's a lot to be learned from just sketching, your movements or, whatever it is. And
Yep.
I,
I encourage everyone to journal. I mean, writing down anything is super important. And then I tell them just compliment it with doodles. Don't judge it, and stick figures, because an average person draws a stick figure and they'll remember so much more clearly from that than they will from verbiage. And both are really important. I have 20 journals going at a time,
Mm.
and they don't even have a purpose. They just cross over and mutate. But I always need to be scrawling down thoughts and ideas. And sometimes at 2 a.m, you cure cancer. You wake up the next day and go, "What is this?" You have no idea what you wrote, But generally, it helps and it supports that kind of development.
yeah, it's just funny too, because we learn that is just not even on most educational systems radars at all. You have to go
Yeah,
find that, oh, this was a thing yourself. And
yeah,
I just bought like I have a black journal. It's like my yearly journal, but I just like invested in like, I got a green journal to try to have basically be my doodle journal for like athletic movement and try to like really, so I'm excited to get that going. I'd love to see what your journals look like. And
they're a mess. If you look at the back of Unconstrained, on the back cover, there are all these little pale sketches, and those are sketches from my journals where I just do like, but I have like boxes of journals. They're just ridiculous. But yeah, they're a mess. I write in the margins. I write in books. I write in everything I read. I constantly am writing in the margin and indexing pages and putting thoughts. And so I was just rereading a Nietzsche book I hadn't read since I was 19. And I was like, oh my God, these are great ideas. They were the ones I wrote on the cover. So I started writing down, ideas for the next book. But yeah, I think it's important. You gotta document, I say it's our cave paintings. We have to leave it for the people after us. Yeah.
That is so true. Yeah, my problem is I'm so like, I will write notes and then never look at it again. And I'm like, oh man, if I could just condense this into a little picture, I feel like that would be a lot better for me to come back to and like remember. So that's I'm looking forward to doing more of that. I actually, now I think about it, I like on the cover of the Unconstrained, it's like two zombies, like two kids.
Yeah. Those are my drawings. That's mine. Yeah. So that's it's my two guys in prison gis. So they're in their little martial art uniforms. And I was originally I was going to do like very stick figure-y, and then I was looking at some Tim Burton sketches, because Tim Burton has amazing sketches. And then I kind of went down that road. But the idea is that they're lost in awe as they walk out of the world of the box, the freedom, the horrible freedom.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I want to get to, hopefully I have time to talk about some of the Unconstrained. Towards the end, I'm like, man, the strength stuff, I'm like, I could just keep following up here. But I do actually want to get into something you said, Kevin, was basically doing things that are like I know this was in the book, so I'll just say this was like, like if you do a push-up, usually we're used to exhaling on the push-up. So, but you should also practice inhaling.
Yes.
I think it just speaks to like, we live in this optimized society where it's like everything has to be optimal and perfect. Like you mentioned with the marathon example. And I think, track sprint coaches probably take it differently, but even I'll even say like, it's funny because I know there's track coaches, it's like always always sprint with the wind. Like we don't want to sprint against the wind. And I do get that. Like I get you want to do the fastest thing, especially if it's not, we're not like trying to be marathon runners. We're not trying to do Spartan races. We're just trying to do one thing fast. But it's funny. I think back though to when I was in college, I had a training partner, and this is set and setting, my best year. And it was a lot of things. It wasn't just the training, but I had a training partner, this guy from Idaho, and just a tough guy. And I remember on his own accord, if it was a windy day, all the other kids were like, we're going to sprint with the wind. Or coach was like, we're going to sprint with the wind. And he's like, I want to sprint against the wind. Like he was just that type of person. And the funny thing is this wasn't a guy who was just like this slow tank. Like he was a really good long jumper, like All-American long jumper. He would have been All-American high jumper, but he like tweaked his neck trying to arch too hard or something like that. And threw the javelin a mile and could 5'10" and could reverse duck. Like he was an explosive dude. But he also just had this mentality that he would take the hard way. And being around, he was my training partner that whole year. And just being around him, I mean, I was the kind of guy who wanted to probably sprint with the wind. Like I wouldn't have loved, but I think the thing that I look at is it didn't hurt his ego that his time was slower. I think that's the big thing that I've gotten to is I've sometimes I think we get in this container where anything that makes your time slower or your jump less or anything, and again, you want to always trend upwards. You always want to have that mindful upward trend, but sometimes we get so attached to the score's got to be better. Even Jump Mat is a common training tool where you jump and it tests your air time and it gives you a jump. And what kids always inevitably end up doing is they lift their feet up or knees up at the end. They land in a tuck so the score says higher.
Yeah.
But then if you ask them to land with straight legs and the score says lower, like their ego would have a hard time taking it. It's like, like, I don't want to see that, and he didn't mind seeing that. Like, he was like, I'm okay with this, and this, I think to me, it's that mentality that's so good.
Yeah. Rocky Marciano had said that amateurs fight to win, champions fight to learn.
Yes.
And I think that's it. Like if every part of your training is so hinged on winning and improving fractions of a second, you're completely ego attached. You're competing with, I recorded a podcast just yesterday on cold water dousing. And I was kind of critiquing one of the dangers with like the Wim Hof method. It's very good, but at some point, always trying to push past the limit. You're trying to compete with nature itself. You know what I mean? And I get it. I get it. My brother was a world-class rock climber. I get that desire and that's great. But at some level in your training, you have to go inwardly. You have to look at yourself. Otherwise, it's nihilism. You're going to just destroy yourself. You cannot keep going endlessly like that. So I think, and I was like that when I was young. I was investing in first it was speed, then it was just power, then it was size, then it was, and then you get to a point where you start to lose those things with age, and then it's just maintenance. And then I said, no, it's got to be, I want to have better mobility than when I was young, better sensitivity, better understanding. Thomas Hanna wrote a book called Somatics, and he said that, we all have this belief that it's necessary for us to become decrepit when we age, even though every single one of us has examples of successful aging. You can all think of somebody who looks great for their age or super fit for their age or, whatever. So you have those breakthrough examples, and yet we just accept the consensus that I must necessarily rot. And, as Louis C.K. says, it's like that now. So I try to always balance that. I want to make sure it's okay that I get slower as I'm older and I don't have the reaction time. But do I need to lose mobility? Can I not gain new insights on how to selectively contract and release? Can I not have more refined movement? If you think of like an elder doing Tai Chi, within that constrained spectrum of movement, they've achieved so much understanding. So it might be more funneled, but the depth, the quality of movement is incredible. So I think that's something the martial arts has that maybe the combat sports lose. When you think of a boxer, you don't often think of them aging gracefully. Or a gymnast times out, oh, you're 30, you're too old for this. And in weightlifting, I remember people being merciless on Schwarzenegger when he went into public life and lost his physique. And now you see him back in the gym with the same work ethic as a younger man, but he's still older, I think that's very important because socially we don't have as many healthy examples of gracefully aging elders. And there's a lot of kind of demand for the next newest idea. I think that's dangerous culturally. All of my great teachers were much older than me, and they were custodians of ancestral knowledge. And we're not going through anything that our ancestors haven't already experienced. AI might be a new face, but it's still the same problem, right? Of losing value and purpose and replacement and invitations to lethargy and all the rest of it. So I think that's a super important component in any fitness training. Try to get the old boxing coach's view in the corner. He doesn't have to still be able to do it to improve you.
Yeah. It's interesting with the boxing, especially I almost look at that as I guess if you looked at all the track events, in some respect, it's the 60-meter dash, just the shortest, most fiery thing compared to all the other potentials. And I'm a big fan of trying to maintain a fast twitch, fountain of youth vibe as you go. At least in the track world, the joke is that all the long distance runners at the Masters track meet look 10 years older than they are. And all the sprinters and throwers and jumpers look a little bit younger. There's certainly that piece to it. But I also... I look at even for myself, even all the sprinting and jumping and things, I'm 42 and it's look, I'm not going to high jump what I did when I was in my 20s. I wish, but to go through it with more of a mindfulness, where it's its own, you're uncovering the layers of yourself in a way that it transcends the ultimate performance, but it does actually help me even relative to a 42-year-old. I can run it better. But the thing, I want to tie it back to what you said with the tension, I notice I have so much, even when I demonstrate like skips and gallops to my jumps group, where I coach at high school, like I'll notice like so much like extra shoulder tension, like where it's almost like I didn't get quite the bounce I wanted to. So I compensate by just a little bit more, like this tight, like little lift of my shoulders and jaw. And I'll see videos. I saw this even in my early 30s of myself doing plyometrics. So I was like, man, do I really have that much tension in my face? Like,
Yeah.
and I think it's just this programming of and it goes back to, you said, well, what's your why? Like, why do you have to jump this high? Like, and you kind of can track that back. But for me, I love what you said about like draw your attention to it. Like sometimes like I'll do that where I will tense my face and neck more, like like before I jump, just to see how like almost silly it feels. Like why would you do this?
Yeah.
And then you just let your body do, and it's like, oh, this is much more of a connected experience. But it's interesting because the more you observe athletes, and I just think about the observational muscles. This is something I'm more on now. But you watch like facial expressions and postures and just your presentation and what's going through your mind when you move. And I just think I see so many people just carrying so much tension and expectations and pressures. And I think about, well, how can I create a experience that allows them to, at least in their body, at least experience a little bit more fluidity and grace, and hopefully that'll carry over into all of how you move. So I love that you mentioned that the pretension. Actually, if you have any more expansion on that, because I think I just jumped to another topic.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more of your take on that.
I mean, the first thing I always say is, especially with speed, it's a mindset, right? So like if you believe that you must necessarily be slower because you're injured, heavy, older, whatever, you will be slower. But if you refuse that, I mean, mental acuity, just sharpness, responding to things, wit, literacy, all of those things are important for mental speed. Observation. One of the things I see a lot is we focus on adaptability. And I'll have soldiers, special forces guys, cops coming in, talking about how they want to be adaptive in combat. But then, as with most of society, they become so polarized in their worldviews. If you're from the wrong political party, they won't talk to a family member. And I always quote Mark Twain. He says, do something every day you don't want to do. Speak every day with somebody that has the complete opposite view of you, and try to open yourself to it. Like try to just say, okay, where are they coming from? I'm forgetting the name of the anthropologist, but he said that you might have somebody with a complete opposite view. They might be, for example, racist or discriminatory. You're not going to understand that view to their level, but can you find one step to the left of them that you agree with? Can you find, something close that it could be minor, could be a food choice, it could be weather, it could be whatever, but just step one step to the side to try to find commonality. That is so important for just adaptability. Every day I try to read things that I don't agree with just to test my perspective. That keeps you buoyant. That keeps you flexible. And when you get to something like speed, you got to think fast. You have to think of what that motive is. You have to, in our cases, we're talking about, deflecting somebody who has a finger on a trigger, or your life is on the line. So everything is an existential crisis. I personally, I don't know if you've ever read Ernest Becker, Denial of Death, but I deeply agree with him that all action is either running towards a fear of death or running in opposition to it. It's always an existential resolve. When somebody says, oh, I just want to do martial arts, or I want to lift weights because I just want to get healthier, what's the deeper meaning? What's the fear? Why are you concerned with how it looks? Why do you want to get bigger? It's not just to feel good. There's some kind of, we had a guy at our school who was a world-class bodybuilder, and he had reverse anorexia. He was enormous, but he thought his legs were skinny. His calves were bigger than my thighs, But I could literally say, man, I'm going to round kick that little breadstick leg and break it in half. The guy would break into tears. He believed it was true, right? So if you're not fixing that, and 300 pounds of muscle on top isn't improving it, you got to look at the source, right? So I think everything ultimately has to lead back inside the self, to the mindset, to the motive. Otherwise, it's all, we always say motive matters more than method. The why is always got to be bigger than the how, because that's what's going to, when you have your career-ending injury, like I had when I was 19, and the doctor told me, you're never going to train again, the first thing in my head I thought is, I'm not taking advice from this fat old guy.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I refused. I was like, no, he's not going to be my fitness goal. He's not my guru for this. And I went into the dojo the next day with a cast on my foot that had a blood stain through it, put a plastic bag on, and I kept going. Did I go too hard? I have no lasting injury, but the mental resolve, the resilience, the desire, the refusal to quit, that's super important. You have to cultivate that.
Yeah. I just thought about something where you mentioned the person who's basically building a suit of armor in the gym, and I think you go to most gyms and you're going to see that individual where you can
100%.
tell it's more than just, oh, I'm happy, I'm building muscle and I'm feeling better and fitter. It's like
Yeah.
I'm building a suit of armor to protect myself from
Yeah.
whatever has happened to me or my perception of the world or whatever it is. And, I mean, and I've certainly, I definitely, I'm not huge and jacked, but I definitely catch myself, like, if I've been improving
Sure.
my muscle mass, like in a certain movement, I'm like, oh, all right, like this is great, and
That's good. Yeah.
I have that part to myself.
Everybody does.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was thinking about like isometric hold, like that's almost a polarity in some sense, like, and I love how you mentioned the spectrum too. I had a question for you about like the spectrum and like, worldviews and stuff. But yeah, I feel like in an ISO hold that you're almost, especially like somewhere there's no mirror even around, like it's like a push up or something face down, and it's just you and the fatigue. There's a
Yeah.
very different side of that for sure versus things that are very visual and very hypertrophy and muscle size oriented. There's definitely I wouldn't say it's an equalizer entirely, but there's definitely a lot more inward travel in those types of items. I don't think you necessarily see those people who are building a suit of armor just flock to like a max time push up to get inner wisdom
Yeah.
type situation. There's definitely, I think, a little bit of an opposite ends of the spectrum there.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. I think my first experience was like kneeling meditation because it was so painful to kneel for an hour.
Hmm.
And my first great teacher told me, like, until you communicate with your body and you tell them that you're not in the gym, you're not going to be able to find the door to the temple. You got to, if you're just approaching this as physical pain and someone's like, can I change my leg position? I have bad knees around. He just didn't care. He's like, everyone can do it, just do it. That was it. And then you did. You got to a point where it wasn't just comfortable, it was no longer worthy of consideration. And then you had exhausted so many excuses and so much mental weakness, you were just calm. Right. So the more pain in the legs, I always say, the greater the payoff when you get through it. And it's true of anything. And so, of course, we had like the horse stance and the protracted positions and the standing meditation. So it was a little bit easier to see the connection. It was 1 degree of separation. But as a young man kneeling, I was like, this is not good for my knees. Like, do white people have different knee structures? I was making all these excuses, and I'm too bony. I don't have enough padding and whatever. It was all crap. And now I just have no tolerance for excuses like that. I enforce it on myself. And thankfully, I have a good sentimental anchor back to those victories so that it pulls me through. But my teacher, had I not had that teacher as an example, just looking unimpressed, going, I just didn't care. That was a huge thing. I wanted to please him. I wanted to be like him. He had incredible capacities, and so many of the teachers I've trained with, they just did these mutagenic things. And you're like, okay, I want that, and that's a big part of it too. But yeah, learning to be still is an important thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's something with the teaching of that. I know we all have our own personalities for sure, but I think about
Sure.
like the person, and I don't know the extent of these stories, but like the modern facility, or even scholastic setting to a degree, but people are paying you to come in the door. Like, do you want to, you have this impression like you want to cater to them and you want to make sure they're getting a good experience, and you do.
Yeah.
And there is also like that, there's also that, I think about like the dojo where you don't pay to get in, you just have to earn your way in. And
Yeah.
like if you do the horse dance outside the door and then the teacher isn't impressed with you, like, but like how do we kind of get that real intersection of making someone work for it versus also being empathetic and uplifting,
Yeah.
and being in the student's best interest. I think about that sometimes.
Well, all of my students will tell you I'm terrible at business. So it's not a great business model, but especially like you have to charge for some stuff. And I was always too cheap, and that's just my nature. But for a black belt exam, I've only given 10 in my life. It didn't matter if the exam's 24 hours long. There was no charge. And I always said, the first thing you need to know is you're not buying this rank. It will be given if it's earned, right? So then this way, if at 13 hours into the exam you break down, no problem. We'll let you recover maybe next year, but there's no obligation. There's no sense of entitlement. And the student walks into that mentally naked. So there's a no shit factor right away. But when they earn it, they know they're not just earning the rank, they're passing through a crucible. Right? They're learning. And that's very important. We did not have ever in any of my styles, the 2-hour exam where you run through technique. It was largely psychophysical, long marathon sparring, long marathon holds and positions, cold water exposure, long meditation, right back into fighting. So it was a roller coaster of physical and emotional. And that's the only way I know how to get there. There might be better ways other people have found, but this has always done it for me. All of the students, I'm blessed to have students that have been with me 25 to 30 years, and they love it. They're still there for that. They come, even if they only come occasionally to train, they come to train because they want that purging, or the check-in, the diagnostic on where they're at.
Yeah. The world we live in, I think about like those adventure races that really sprung up maybe 15 years ago, like the Tough Mudder.
Yeah.
Like we live in such a comfortable society. People almost yearn for something that is harsh and uncomfortable. And even like you mentioned with nature, like Wim Hof method and cold exposure, like on the inside, we do yearn for some of those things. And one of the things on I guess the spectrum you mentioned that I think about, I didn't have this as a formal question, but I would love your opinion on it because in some sense, I feel like, like a track and field, like a sprinter who needs to be fresh and fast, and they can't accumulate too many like high fatigue workouts. They needs to trend that way versus like some need for like initiation, I guess you could say. Like I think that's where a lot of like football programs that have some brutal workout. Like I remember the college I used to work at, D3 NCAA school, like the coaches having like these guys do like CrossFit or football CrossFit. And I mean, it's just not even specific at all. Like linemen doing burpees and running laps. And me and the head track coach, we would just sit and laugh because we're like, this is so non-specific. And honestly, it is, if you look at a dial of like good versus excessive and totally out of context, it was all the way totally out of context. I don't think it was, and the team wasn't very good. But like, I look at also the shade of like, okay, like you have like a threshold workout. Like this is a ritual workout we do. And it's easy to be very polarized, like, oh, this is just too much conditioning and blah, blah, blah. But I'd also think about, like, if you took a team that had, like, a big, heavy conditioning emphasis and you just found the shade that you do agree on. On my end, I don't think we do enough of that because I do think there's something in there, like I just mentioned, like, that, like, there's something to be found with something that's difficult. And it's very easy to lose that, I think, sometimes. So I'm always kind of looking for, well, where's that place in the middle that like, oh, this is the sweet spot. This is a ritual thing that is hard and it's a threshold like activity. And now what's appropriate for my group here? I think we could use a lot more conversation on my end of the fence with that and finding, what a good level is.
What I refer to it in my book as a sort of a representational dial or representativeness dial.
Yes, yeah.
Where, and I say it's arbitrary. Like for us, the representation is combat, but for you, it could be an end event or what competition. Yeah. It's fine to have things like wearing a uniform. That used to apply very closely to what people wore in the street. As a Canadian in the winter, a gi jacket is pretty similar in handles to a winter coat. So there's still some application. If I lived in Fiji, you might say, well, what's the point of wearing these pajamas? I'm never going to have this on. So your representativeness might be much lower. But it's okay if you have sentimental attachment. If you put on that belt, you knot it up and you feel like Batman, and that motivates you. Like when I'd go to the dojo, the minute the belt was tied, I'd go, okay, now I'm training. Like all the problems, the bills, the arguments, it's all gone. So if there's that value, then there's that value. There might be things like, burpees and whatever that don't apply to the movement. But if it is a ritual is so important, if it is some kind of team building exercise, or if it's just tough, if it's just building resilience, at some level, you could argue it's like a 1 or a 2 on representativeness. But on another level, you could argue that resiliency is the most universal commodity that you have. Right. So it's really how you look at it. And what I say in my book is that it doesn't matter that we agree what's a 3 or what's a 4. It matters that you give some consideration. And so if everything I have is a 1 or a 2, well, that's mental masturbation. That's just feel good stuff. That's not training. So I do have to have some stuff that's really close simulation training. For me, I need to lose. I need to get beaten up a little bit. I need to feel a bigger, stronger person owning me, in the gym. I need to work with a boxer to go, oh, yeah. I need those reminders because it's important for the humility. It's important to understand what you can do. We always say that it's good to know what your go-to is, what your refined toolbox of skills, but you got to be able to get to your go-to. And the biggest thing in the way of you getting to your go-to is your ego, your humility, right? As a bouncer, 99.9% of what I saw was avoidable. It was just ego, and people end up with criminal records, going to jail, losing eyes, crippling themselves because of ego, right? So that taught me a lot very young about, I was in that world trying to understand aggression. And then I quickly realized, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like that. So that was very important. And I think in an athletic world, seeing how people age, seeing how they handle retirement, those are big things.
Mm-hmm.
If my boxing coach was aging gracelessly and kept going back in the ring and it was getting hit too much, I'd be like, maybe I got to take more of this with a grain of salt. Yeah, because if you follow the same path, you're going to end up in a similar spot.
Mm. Yeah, Kevin, let's talk about that with that dial, because I really like that part of the Unconstrained book, and I do think it's just so funny how oftentimes it's so black and white. Oh, it's either representative or it's just not, and it's just worthless, or something like that. And tell me, how you actually view if something is representing sport or combat, or it's just mindless and everything in the middle. Tell me about how you feel that.
I mean, in the world of ecological psychology, right? The whole idea with the ecological approach as a worldview is that it's impossible to have so your perception of how you see things around you, your cognition of how you process it, and the actions that you ultimately manifest are all deeply coupled. And they're all tied to your environment. It was all going back to a Soviet researcher, Nikolai Bernstein, and his first famous study was, of course, what could be more Soviet than hammering, blacksmithing? Were they hammering sickles, one presumes? But he just realized that no two hammer strokes were the same. And so he came up with the simple epiphany that, if you think of how many thousands of degrees of motions we have, actions and variabilities in something like reaching for a glass, we have to restrain the vast majority of them for us to pick up a cup and take a drink. And so he said, all actions are constrained, refined movement. Therefore, should we not learn through constraint? If the environments, the demands of our environment, are restraining us all the time, would this not be the best way to get into it? And when he came up with that theory, Pavlov was the dominant scientist in Soviet Russia, which for the government was amazing, right? It's reward and punishment. That's what we want our people to be. So Bernstein was fired from his job, lost his post, and he was forbidden nobody would publish him. And that manuscript, I think it's Dexterity and Perception, I'm forgetting the name, was left in a drawer for like 40, 50 years. And we're lucky it survived. But now this whole burgeoning field we see based on ecological psychology, it's largely founded on his principles. And so the idea is that you look at how can you manipulate your environment, how can you manipulate the task at hand, or how can you limit or constrain the performer. And from a combative point of view, this means you're always training adaptability. So this is, for me, it's a no-brainer. The argument would be, okay, well, if you're just going to do a drill on this, parry with this hand, but do whatever you want and then counterpunch, you're never really refining good technique. This is always the argument. But then what is good technique? Every technique is like a snowflake. No two are the same, right? So that's just an ego judgment. And we have now, famously in ecological jiu-jitsu, Greg Saunders' team, at the beginning, everyone thought it was loopy. Now they're winning. So then people are like, okay, let's go. So now they come in and they want to maraud and just pick pieces. But it's the wholeness of the approach that matters. It's the confidence to say, I'm going to put myself in a blender and see what happens. So it would be sprinting against the wind, sprinting with the parachute. Let's do a few rounds on one leg. Now let's run with one eye closed. Now let's run without breathing. One of my favorite running drills, and we bring it in, it's a Kenyan runner drill. I bring it into training all the time. Just fill your mouth with water and train. Right? The Kenyans identified that when you start mouth breathing, you're in a higher level of fatigue. So let's physically measure when that happens and give you a motivation to nasal breathe as long as you can to expand the nasal threshold. right? It's a very simple thing. Spartans did it with reeds underwater. Different cultures just did breath holds. So we'll constrain everything. The debate then becomes, do you decompose or do you simplify? Do you break up a task into 100 motor units and refine each one? So for the cop, it's acquisition of the weapon, clearing the clothing, trigger squeeze, or do you focus on one element and always train the wholeness of the motion? I sacrilegiously do both. I think simplification and deconstruction can be helpful, especially when we find hiccups, when we find our triggers. We have areas that are needing lubrication or sanding of a corner off. Most of the time, however, I try to just simplify it down to the whole action. So if I was teaching basketball, you might have the goal of only using your right hand. You can't use your left to chamber it. You're allowed to do it however you want. You dribble, you move, you do any footwork, any breathing, and that gives a certain awareness. Then you switch hands. Then you limit your breathing, etc. So you're always doing a full spectrum of action. If I identify something in that crucible that is particularly weak for one individual, then I might simplify for that individual and break it down to a smaller component. In solo training, I try to balance it. Maybe 20, 30% of the time I simplify. I'll work on things like weapon access or particular motion patterns. But generally, I then always try to end with a totality. I try to end with the full meal, if you will. And one of the things that we're big on is you can push to failure as much as you want. I use Donald Mickenbaum's term for stress inoculation. He says you have to educate to understand why you're doing what you're doing. You have to rehearse. So you practice under incrementally growing resistance, and then you culminate in a pressure test. And the only distinction between a pressure test and a highly tense resistant rehearsal is that in the pressure test, you might actually start to fail more than you succeed. But I never end a session with that. So if we do a scenario training or something where you get the snot beaten out of you, then we slow it down and I bring it to a threshold where you feel successful and you can apply. That's the whole Mickenbaum formula. You then go back to the education phase, back to the rehearsals. So we call it sealing with success. And it was born from seeing so many law enforcement and military trainers who would give you a very feel-good two-day progressive training arc and then at the end crush you. And you leave going, man, nothing worked, right? And this is the worst thing. Give them an extra 30 minutes to say, what one thing can we improve? You create the drill, let's customize it. Now let's slow it down until you have resistance, you have friction, you have failure, but you ultimately are succeeding as a whole. You're not dying. Yeah, okay, you got stabbed a few times, but you got out, right? This is super important because otherwise you lose the motivation. In the martial arts, we always say that if you quit at yellow belt, like that's sometimes the worst thing in the world because you just accept, that's all I can do. If you quit midway, you're more likely to come back. So it's important. I try to I always take it personally, even if I at some level know it's not my fault. It pains me when I lose a student. I always want to try to appeal to them. And if they have to quit because of life, that's one thing. But if they quit because they give up, that's a terrible thing. I really don't want to contribute. We always say that training should not be trauma. So, yeah.
So your system is your home base is kind of like simplify, but then decompose if a student needs like kind of gaps to be filled in or weak points.
Yeah. So like, let's say the police that I go in to teach have a lot of excessive force complaints and they're always kneeling on people's backs. So we might simplify that action and look at variables, and we might do drills where there's a time limit, like you can only kneel on the back for 3 seconds and you got to get off. There might be a punishment like a tasing or something, a little bit of, Pavlovian reinforcement. But then we give them variables and then we teach them movement drills, and we might do some embodied movement solo where they learn to move smoothly on a punching bag. Then they do some more arrest scenarios and we see if it comes out. And then whatever they're doing, we try to provide them with replacement scaffolding. But ultimately, to test it, there has to be a simplified but fully contextual event. You're doing the run. If you're doing a sprint, you have to ultimately do the sprint to see what's coming out in the wash. Then we go back to the drawing board again. Sometimes only simplification works. Sometimes people are overthinking things, so then we don't simplify because it'll be too much. If they're worried about specific things and techniques or trying to enforce their will, then we'll just simplify and they'll generally abandon that on their own.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. I think culturally, we are very almost like addicted to the decomposition. Like I think it's sprinting. It's like everyone loves
Yep.
sprint drills. And honestly, it's funny because I used to be like almost the term I want to say is oversimplified, but like I would live in simplification. Anything that's decomposition, like even the sprint drills, I was like, man. Honestly, in the last few years, I've definitely come back into more of the apply. Here's a great place for more some of that decomposed work and to fill in gaps and things like that. But it just seems like as a society, we're so addicted with, like just breaking things down to parts and thinking that's going to solve the issue. Do you look at our culture like the same way we've talked about Russia, which I think is so interesting? Like, I'm so interested in Russian, sports science and motor learning. I love all the little cultural influences and how it got that way. Any thoughts on why our culture is so into just the decomposition versus the constraint based or simplified approach?
I mean, it's just our tradition. In the Western world, you look back at like the Greek scholars, they were very competitive and deconstructional, and they were trying to find out, bringing things down to their base parts. The Renaissance, that had a huge resurgence of that kind of thinking. The Russians did not experience most of the defining characteristics of the Western world, the Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance, all these things. They had very different experiences. They also had a border that was very porous. They had a lot of foreign occupation. They lost a lot of wars, huge land expanse, lots of different geographical conditions, much more of a melting pot. So that definitely influenced their thinking. If you go to like most Asian countries, they have a very strong system of apprenticeship, which we have less of. So like a Japanese painter would have learned to mimic exactly their master's style, where that would be something completely different from us, And then modern Western world, complete existentialist explosion, and we have art movements like Dadaism, and so it's different. It's different, But I think that is part of how we're schooled. We are taught still through a lot of rote memorization. So when if you go to a martial arts school or a gym and they make you do it exactly this way 1,000 times, we still have this internalized belief that repetition is the mother of all skill. And if I do it enough, I'll be good. Even if it's, as Tony Blauer famously said, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. Otherwise, you could just be, perfectly crappy. You might be doing something wrongly. But a lot of people really have that notion, like, I'll just do more and more will be better. I'll figure it out eventually. And it doesn't hold out to be true. We know from constrained and ecological approaches, the example I give, because we're dealing with combat, is that any animal in the wild, like a tiger, will have a baby born. That baby can be eaten today, but no part of the tiger has evolved to line it up in a row and teach it formal technique. It plays, it bites, it rolls, and humans do the same thing. As kids, how did you run? How did you do gymnastics? Naturally. Right? We lose that primal tribal nature of, and what is that? That is an exploration of the environment around us. You don't have to tell a kid to explore. Kid's going to climb it, roll in it, get messy. That's what we're supposed to do. That triggers, and going back to the Tough Mudder and the Spartan races and all of that, those are great, but that's kind of like a vacation from reality. Vacation can relax you, but it doesn't cure your tension, which is why in Rituals of Strength, you used the word ritual before. I think you need to have a shrine. You need to have a place that could be the corner of your house, your garage, someplace that's sacred. You then need to have a ritual. And I quote the Shinto maxim that for something to be sacred, it needs to be simple enough to be done every day. And then it must be done every day. And in those rituals, you need to microdose pain and discomfort. Not once a year at the Tough Mudder, but you need to do it like 5 times a day. Yeah. Every day, 30 seconds of cold shower, intermittent fast, delay, you got something in the mail, you want to open it, wait 2 hours on the Amazon package, delay gratification every day. So if you can do 5 of those, you can do 10. If you can do 10, you do 30. So I'm always trying to control impulse. And that just pays dividends everywhere. That's how, and the neuroscience is clear because the portion of the brain, the anterior midcingulate cortex, that's where your willpower fundamentally resides. That basically is dead in people that aren't feeling resilient. But as soon as you expose yourself to discomfort, it flashes up. And the best example is if you take like a suicidal teen, you see them when they're in a manic depressed suicidal state. It's dormant. It's complete cognitive constriction. So if you ask them, well, why don't you do this or this or this? They do not see an option. Life is terrible. I must die. But then if you interview somebody who survived suicide, a failed attempt, suddenly there's a complete thrive awakening. Oh my God, what did I do? Right? So my whole thing is, can we not get to that point voluntarily?
Yeah.
In my teen self-defense book, I open with a paragraph about I was teaching a kid who was obviously self-cutting, self-harming, and she had all this judgment. And I said, well, look at my knuckles. Like, I'm self-harming, but mine looks a bit cooler socially. Yours is kind of villainized, serving the same purpose. It's a volume dial. I am physically, intentionally controlling this. I do not feel good unless I'm sore. You don't feel good unless you're sore, And then she kind of was like, yeah. I said, okay, so let's just try to find things that are a little safer, because this is not mangling me and exposing me and you're cutting yourself quite badly. Let's find something that you can control more easily, and let's, and redirect it. You take away the stigma and the shame. We're all the same. We're all the same. We're all seeking the same thing, just in different forms, right? So I think that's important. And when we microdose little bits of discomfort, we remind ourselves of our capacity. Those parts of our brain light up. We become addicted to it. We want it. It's like when you go to the gym, when you're working out regularly, you can't wait to go. But when you fall off, it seems insurmountable to go back. So if you little microdoses, a little bit of ice water in your morning, a little bit of a fast, little things like this, mindset difference, a little bit of journaling, little tweaks like that, you'll get back to the gym way faster, with less judgment, with less, self-deprecation and all the rest of it.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with like the Tough Mudder, right? That as a vacation, because what if the next day you just sit there and you open the app and Amazon package instantly, which I think we almost all do. And I know.
I know. I got one.
Phone,
I got one waiting for me.
You get on your phone and start scrolling right away. It's like, well, what did that do? And that's the thing I struggle with more than almost anything, in the sense, like, I can work out very hard. Like, and most of my stuff's pretty quality, but like if you gave me a difficult work, I almost thrive. I think some of it's almost like letting out like repressed anger, like, and just using that as a fuel to just, honestly, I feel like I look at my psyche, I'm like, what do I have to be angry about? Some Chinese medicine practitioner told my pulse once, and he's like, I think you have a lot of repressed anger. I was like, really? Like, but then I can like see it, because sometimes when I'm training, it's almost like, where's this fuel coming from? Like, what's driving me? Like, why is this? But I was going to say is, for me, like, the hard thing is like fasting, or even like I was reading the Mighty Adams book, and that guy fasted a full day twice a week. Like, it's almost like frequent enough, so you're always kind of doing it. And it's, for me, I've always done cold showers, but that's actually kind of easy. What's hard is my neighbor has an ice tub, and I don't know where the research sits on. People are like, oh, they're dumb ice tubs, or they're good. And I'm like, you know what? It's hard, and it's something that gets me going in the morning. That's difficult. So I'm like, if I can do that, and then not, and like, I just got that brick thing for the phone, like, and I can stick the brick thing on the phone. Like, okay, I'm doing pretty good. But I'd say fasting is just the killer. I look at how nothing tells me how soft I am than fasting. Because as soon as I do, my wife lets me know. She's like, you have to tell everyone you're fasting, don't you? Because it's like, I'm such a wuss with it, man. Like, it's so bad. I mean, people would look at me and train and think, oh, that guy's probably pretty tough. And it's like, I don't know. As soon as that starts getting thrown in the equation, it's a different story.
Yeah, we all have our Achilles heels.
Yeah. It's almost like, modern life, we almost have to. It's funny how we almost have to engineer some of this stuff. Whereas, like, the Mighty Atom, or like just life, like 100 years ago, it's interesting. I think about it. Sometimes.
But don't for a second think they wouldn't have wanted warm showers if they could have had them.
That is totally true. That is totally true.
We are comfort seekers.
Yes. Oh, yeah, without question. Well, hey, Kevin, I think, I'm going to put a bow on this conversation here.
Perfect.
I got like half of the questions. I didn't even get a Systema and the pillars of Systema. I'm going to
don't worry about it,
because I'm super excited to talk to you about that one. Hopefully on the road. But hey, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people learn more about you and your books? I know you mentioned a few of them. I mentioned it.
Yeah. Everything is available on Amazon. I have 8 titles. They're all there. I've got a online video site, kevinsecours.com. And you can find me on YouTube. I've got 600-700 videos there. Or you can reach out anytime. My email's kevinsecours@hotmail.com. Always welcome inquiries and questions from anyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really great talking to you, Kevin.
It's my pleasure, brother. Thank you so much.